Well, hey everybody, it is noon and we're going to do something a little bit different today. As you know, yesterday we dove into Psalm 79 and we talked about God being for His own glory and how that should recalibrate our lives as a church. And one thing that sort of came out of that is that, man, I just had so much stuff. At the end, I was sitting there cutting left and right. There's a ton of stuff that I just couldn't make it in there. And quite honestly, that's a lot of Sundays. And I thought, you know what? This is one of those times where we can step back on a Monday. I was going to do this earlier in the day, but my schedule kind of got hijacked a little bit. But where we could take a time and come in and focus on what that means. Maybe dig a little bit deeper. Maybe clarify some of those things that didn't, maybe it didn't really hit with you. You got a question. So I encourage you, go ahead. If you've got a question, something in there that you would like to ask from that, just go ahead and drop one in the comments there, and I'll see those here. But as we were talking yesterday and working through that psalm, we said God is for His own glory. It's the greatest, really is the greatest driver for His action. And that's one of those things where it seems a little jarring. We aren't used to that. That's not something we typically think about. That's not something we typically talk about because we just don't for whatever reason. But really, that's something, going back through Christian history, that's really been in there for since the beginning. But I just wanted to pull out a couple of examples here. One is the Westminster Catechism. I like the Westminster Catechism. It's pretty great because it's pretty straightforward there. And question 1 is, what is the chief end of man? It's a great question. Hey, here's who we are. What are we meant to do? And the answer is this: man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. That's why we're created. That's what we are made to do. And so if what they do is they pull out certain verses that kind of point us in that direction. They pull out Psalm 86:9. All nations whom you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and they shall glorify your name. This is where we're going. This is what is the end here. We're all moving in that direction. We'll all glorify the name of God. And they also pull out the command that Paul gives us in Romans 10:31, whether then you eat or drink, whatever you do all to the glory of God. And so this is one of those things that really is central to who we are as Christians, who we are as a people. We are made to know and to glorify God. Every single human being at every single moment. That's what we are made to do. And so I just wanted to take a minute this morning, a few minutes, just to kind of pull through that idea through some of those scriptures, kind of show how really we need to refocus and recalibrate sort of how we approach this whole topic. So one I think that you probably know is Psalm 23. If you've been around Christian circles at any length of time, your grandma probably had like a little cross-stitch thing with Psalm 23. Maybe you've got a mug with like Psalm 23 on it. But we need to see, as we work through that, you're going to find something maybe you just sort of skipped over. And so we read, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Like, we're good with that so far. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness. Hey, that's great. All of those are great. All of those things that he's doing are wonderful, but we can't miss the last part of verse 3, for His name's sake. It's one of those verses I think we kind of sort of skip over. Like, He does all those things, but then we miss the reason, for His name's sake. God is always working for His glory and His work in our lives. He's never doing it because, hey, you're great. That's what we have to remember. It's God's working in our lives. It's not because we're great. It's because ultimately He's great. And He is showing His greatness and His mercy to us. And then we can also look over at a verse like Psalm 25:11, where the psalmist prays, for your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my iniquity, for it is great. Think about that. God, hey, look, I don't deserve it. But for your name's sake, for the glory of your name, forgive my iniquity, forgive my sin. So those two verses there, you kind of look at that and okay, that really reshapes and really transforms how we come to the book of Psalms. How we come to Psalms, how we understand what's going on in that. And I think that's really a healthy thing to have happen. But we want to kind of pull that through all of it and see how God always is working for His glory. So you can look at Ezekiel 20, verse 9, where God is speaking and He's telling them that God, He brought the Israelites out of Egypt, not because Israel was perfect, not because Israel was great, not because Israel deserved it, but look what He says in Ezekiel 20, verse 9. He said, I acted for the sake of my name. That's why God brings the people out of Israel, the people of Israel out of Egypt. That's why He acts. And look what He says, that it should not be profaned in the sight of human nations among whom they live, in whose sight I made myself known to them by bringing them out of the land of Egypt. He said, no, you got to understand, I wanted my name to be made great, and so I delivered my people there. Now, of course, it was for Israel's good, right? But the ultimate driving motivation for God, yes, is His glory and their good. So you can't separate those. When God works for His glory, He's working and it results in our good, all right? Remember, if we are created to glorify God, that's the chief purpose and chief end of humanity, then it makes sense that when God works for His glory, it is for our good. All right, so you can always you can look down at something like Psalm 106, where the psalmist acknowledges their sin, and he says, look, we have sinned like our fathers. We have committed iniquity. We have behaved wickedly. So right there it tells us, okay, we're not great. We're pretty broken here. But look what he says now. Our fathers in Egypt did not understand your wonders. They did not remember your abundant kindnesses, but rebelled by the sea at the Red Sea. Nevertheless, He, that being God, saved them for the sake of His name, that He might make His power known. And this is one of those times where I know this is one of those stories where we tend to read ourselves in as the hero, right? We tend to do this. And it's just one of those things that man, it just makes for a great sermon. You really like to hear it, right? Hey, you're like Moses. You're coming up to the Red Sea. It seems like everything, but you're going to get to go through the middle. No, hold on. Keep in mind, God is the hero. God is the one who delivers His people out of their bondage for His name's sake. Can't kind of divorce that. Can't miss that. So I want to keep encouraging us to take that different view, that different way of reading the Bible. And even then we see that Jesus, a couple of weeks ago, we actually hit on this briefly when we were in John chapter 7. But Jesus says, look, I am seeking the glory of the one who sent me. He is true, and there is no unrighteous in Him. The purpose of Jesus coming and what He's doing is He's seeking the glory of God. And so as we kind of step back and we look at that, we see, okay, there's this big picture. In fact, we can look at Habakkuk 2:14. The earth will be filled of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as waters cover the sea. This is where it's all heading. And that's a beautiful picture, and that's a wonderful thing for us to remember as we keep going forward and as it reorients our lives. Now, I know something that gets a little testy for us. Because we think, if God is always for His own glory, does that make God like an egomaniac? You know those me people in your life, and you kind of think, well, I don't like being around them so much. They have this. It's all about them. Does that where it puts God here? Well, I understand what you might be saying there, and so I don't want to just kind of brush that off. Let's just go ahead though and pull back and think about what it means for God to be God and to do what He does. And throughout history, here's going to be one of those times where you just got to put your thinking cap on a little bit. Theologians and philosophers have said, you know what, God always does the greatest thing. He's the greatest being doing the greatest thing for the greatest possible reason. Okay? If God is God, He's always the greatest being doing the greatest thing for the greatest possible reason. So, okay, let's just sort of break that down. He's God. He's the greatest being. And what is the greatest thing that he could do? Well, it would be to magnify that which is great. What is the greatest thing? He would be magnifying and making great the greatest thing. So it would be God glorifying himself. That's what he does, right? Think about it just a little bit. What is the greatest thing that you could do with your life? Would be to make much of the greatest possible thing in your life. That's why we say, so just imagine that for God. He just is the greatest possible thing. So God glorifies himself. That is the greatest being doing the greatest thing for the greatest possible reason, his own glory. And so that sounds really convoluted, sounds really difficult to kind of wrap your brain around, but when we take a step back and just think greatness, how does God magnify the greatest possible thing? And that's it. He glorifies his name. He makes his name great. So, and that's one of those things we just have to kind of chew on for a little while, right? Now, the reality is, though, we are those who are egocentric. We are the me-centered people here. And it seeps through so many ways. Like, it's almost impossible to really get down to all the ways this seeps down into our lives. And so I want to be, just acknowledge that. That's what it is. We are sort of a self-centered people by nature. The very fact of sin is that it's us putting ourselves in the place to make decisions and to do things that we don't have the right to do. So it's very self-centered to begin with. But when we step back and we think about how this permeates our lives, one of the ways that I think we've got to be careful about is the way it permeates our lives in even our worship and even the songs that we sing. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that every song that talks about us is bad. All right, that's not what I'm getting at. But I do think that there's a tendency, if we're not careful, where we can really start talking about ourselves, and we can really come to the place where, man, like that brings us the warm and fuzzies. That's kind of the way it goes. I mean, you don't want to acknowledge that. We don't want to admit it, but that's really how it can happen. In fact, there's one song that aside from one line, I really like the song. It's maybe you've heard it. What a wonderful name it is. I think that's the name of it. But I like the song because there's a lot of stuff in there that's really, really true. But it has one line in it that I'm like, that's just absolutely false. And I think it's the second verse there. It says, "You didn't want heaven without us, so Jesus, you brought heaven down." Now, okay, I understand what they're saying, like God in his greatness brings heaven, but that first part, you didn't want heaven without us. And what that sort of implies, what it basically implies, is that heaven was somehow less than perfect without us in it. That God was somehow lonely, and by us being there, it sort of filled out that picture. And the reality is that's just not true. God doesn't need us. He's not lonely. He's never lonely. He's never sitting there thinking, hey, well, why won't they come to me? He doesn't need us like that. And so when we look at those things, if we're not careful, I think this is one of those areas where our me-centered ideology kind of seeps into even our worship. And so really it does permeate so much of our lives. It really does, and I don't know a better way to kind of to attack that than really what I said yesterday. And maybe I want to provide a little clarification here to develop that God-centered way of reading the Bible. We need that God-centered way of coming to the Scripture. When we are focused on ourselves, we miss the picture. In fact, our own confession, we here at First Baptist Venus, we ascribe to the Baptist Faith, the Message 2000, and it says, hey, what is the Bible? It is God's revelation of himself to man. So when we think about that, look, that means that the central purpose of the Bible is God revealing himself and his glory to us. It's not so now that obviously comes with facts that we understand who we are in relation to God. We understand who we aren't. But the Bible, that means the Bible is not primarily about us. It's about God. It's about him and his glory. And so we have to really be on guard. And I think, and as I've been praying about this, I really do think if we can get that first level, that first order there in how we read the Bible, not only on Sunday morning, but just every day of the week, how we come to the Bible, and really let that sort of guide the rest of what we do, it'll start changing. I believe the Holy Spirit will start moving and reshaping other areas of our lives. Because really, our me-centeredness permeates every part of our being. And so we want to be a God-centered people, and I believe the best place for us to start is there in the Bible. And so that's why I said the best place to start is just asking that simple question when we read a passage, maybe a story in the Bible, just question, what does this tell us about God? Starting there, really pulling that through, asking that first question, making sure that our minds are set on that. And then over time, and like I said, this is not going to be something you wake up tomorrow and your whole life is different. Like, this is going to take time to do. Because it's so ingrained us. It's going to be learning a new thing, a new way of seeing the world and seeing our place in it. But I believe that God will do it if we're just faithful to him over time. All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending just a few moments here to consider, kind of unpack some of those things. If you have any questions, anything kind of comes up, you think about like, hey, what about this? What about that? I'd certainly like to just kind of unpack those whenever I can there for you. All right. Well, thanks again so much. Have a wonderful day. And just remember, God loves you. And he's working in your life for his glory and for your good. All right, guys, I'll see you back here tomorrow at noon, and we will be hopping back into the Gospel of Mark for midday in Mark. Have a great day, and I will see you then.